You're watching InTechnology, a video cast where you can get smarter about cybersecurity, sustainability, and technology.
Hi, I'm Camille Morehart, host of InTechnology podcast. Today, we're going to talk about confidential AI and its policy. I'm co-hosting with Taylor Roberts, who's Director of Global Security Policy at Intel. He has also been Cybersecurity Advisor for the White House and Senior Researcher of Global Cybersecurity Capacity Center at Oxford University. Welcome to the podcast, Taylor, and who have you brought to the table?
Thanks very much for the introduction, Camille. We have sort of both sides of the policy and technology spectrum here in our sort of esteemed guests. We have Jason Lazarski on the industry side, who is the head of sales at Opaque Systems. Jason really looks at the sort of simplifying the landscape of AI or computational computing as it relates to AI, understanding how you can actually transform some of these privacy-enhancing technologies and apply them to the AI context that the sort of policy aspects have been looking to address from a either regulatory or incentive-driven or a variety of different mechanisms, which leads me over to Jonathan, who is the Deputy Assistant National Cyber Director for Technology Security at the White House's Office of the National Cyber Director, who, amongst many other things, really leads the development and the implementation of the AI Executive Order, which was released earlier this year. A really excellent set group of guests, and looking forward to the discussion.
Wow, I wonder if maybe we could just start with Jonathan. Could you give us kind of an overview of some of the critical pieces of that executive order? And if companies are now scrambling, what are they scrambling over?
Thanks, Camille. Thanks, Taylor. So as Taylor mentioned, the administration released a little over 6 months ago the AI Executive Order, which really focuses on outlining the administration's efforts to both lead the way in seizing the promise of AI, but also, of course, managing the risks of the technology as well. There are a couple sections that I want to highlight first, really. Section 4, which covers safety and security, obviously an important topic. That talks about standards development, best practices, talks about the visibility or foundation model security. It also talks about the use of AI in critical infrastructure and cybersecurity. On the privacy side, sort of these new primitives that are arising based off of the data aspect of this technology that we need to contend with in ways we're not used to. Section 9 really talks about advancing privacy-enhancing technology research, development, and implementation. That's been a core theme of the administration's efforts on this front. It looks at how you evaluate the effectiveness of those technologies, and then also looks at how agencies, specifically in the federal government, collect and use commercially available information, especially that incorporates PII. And then Section 10 of the executive order really looks at how is the government responsibly and effectively using this technology? What are the governance frameworks throughout the interagency, departments and agencies? How are we advancing responsible innovation with this technology? And then how are we managing those risks, especially when they start to touch on rights or civil liberties?
I guess I'll ask that second question to Jason, which is how are companies scrambling right now based on the CEO that's come out with so many different sections? And I know not everything is extremely precise in it. There's a lot of sort of guidelines and recommendations. So what are companies struggling with right now?
Yeah, what we're finding here at Opaque is that there's obviously a huge rise in appetite for data, but it's absolutely colliding with security and privacy professionals. So in terms of the enterprise and getting projects into production, they're finding huge roadblocks and hurdles from getting those projects from a pilot phase into a production phase. And what they're finding quickly is that it's not a problem with the AI or the model, it's actually a problem with the data itself. So as we talk to large enterprises, specifically security professionals, privacy professionals, there's really 3 challenges beyond just the regulatory landscape that they have to worry about. One, their data is fragmented in a multiplicity of silos. So within each silo of these large organizations, there's different policies, there's different procedures, there's really even different definitions of what they determine as PII. So there's a huge cultural challenge that they're dealing with. So how do you operationalize sensitive, confidential data, which just so happens to be their most valuable data, across these different silos? Secondly, there's actually a new threat vector as well. So with the rise in the sophistication of AI, it's never been easier for these models to
Actually de-identify data.
So now there's a risk of the model itself de-identifying data and having your data leak that way. And then the third that we're finding, which is pretty common, is that just the traditional tactics of anonymization, masking, tokenization, they're very laborious. They take a long time. It's very costly. And unfortunately, the insights of the models and the accuracy of the models suffer as well.
Just as a quick aside, there's also a broader, not just U.S. specific landscape that should be brought up here as well. In the European Union, they passed EU AI Act. The EU AI Act focuses a lot more on sort of types of risks and prohibiting certain AI systems that could potentially pose specific types of risks, but it's a market access related regulation. Same with the Cyber Resilience Act, which is a product security regulation focusing on restricting market access to those technologies and those products with digital elements that can meet specific security requirements and actually be able to attest to the security associated with those requirements. And these sorts of policy efforts to try to better get a grasp on AI as it evolves, it's an amazing opportunity as well as an amazing challenge, I think, because policy, at least in my experience, has often lagged with greater technological innovation. But I think that the way that OECD has taken the AI executive order, there's a lot of acronyms, by the way. So if I say an acronym, just to let me know, the AIEO is good because it really takes a step back and says, how are we going to evaluate what it is we as government need to do? What is our role in this overall ecosystem? What are some of the challenges that industry can help us solve? And with specific attention to privacy enhancing technologies and ensuring that we are taking into account the security of that sensitive data, as well as Jason brought up the security implications of some of these models, how adversaries can use some of these new techniques to exploit some of our systems. I think it's an opportunity for us to work together in ways that when you have a more entrenched technology, might be more difficult.
I am interested in, I think different governments are going to start wanting to maintain IP, essentially, both in hardware and in software in the development of AI. So rather than this technology being shared universally as it's developed, I think possibly for the first time, this is a technology where the world might see it being developed very differently in one geography from another geography. And I'm wondering, is that happening? And how do we approach this from a policy perspective?
I don't know that we've faced this sort of similar challenge in kind of the history of technology development. There's something so specific to the way that somebody decides to design and develop AI system, which is so critical, I would say, because the data that's being used is such a large input and moves the needle on the output of the system in such a significant way. And I think because of that reason, the U.S. and the administration has been very forward-leaning in making sure that we're looking at this through a global lens, that we're building coalitions with partners and allies across the world to understand not only how are they dealing with it, what are the challenges that they're facing as they start to identify how they want to not just internalize this, but sort of externalize this technology. And then how are we aligning to make sure that the ways that people are approaching this are beneficial for each individual geographic region, for each individual political entity, but then also for the users of that technology. I don't know that we have a perfect answer to the question that you posed. Part of the reason for that is because the technology is still developing so rapidly as well, right? It's not just the application of the technology that we have to deal with, but the pace of technological change is rapid and continuing to increase, right? And at the policy level, we really have to think through how are we setting ourselves up for success? How are we setting the industry up for success by crafting frameworks that are flexible enough to accommodate that sort of technological change, that rapid development, but also giving us the guardrails that allow us to shape the technology in a way that sort of aligns with the values and the institutions that we rely on every day.
I just want to put a fine point on that. There are some specific points of evidence that you can point to, right? So in addition to the high level sort of Bletchley Accords that took place at the tail end of last year, where the US, EU, and other strategic partners agreed to very high level sort of AI principles. There was also a more concrete document that was released, I think, a few weeks later, guidelines for the development of secure AI systems, which was a few U.S. government agencies, the EU and Japan and Singapore, and a few other different governments that all contributed towards this document on. And again, it's not specific controls. It's really focused on the sort of secure by design principles that I think has been embedded in across many different countries, but focused and tailored specifically to some of the challenges of AI. That's not to say that everything is super harmonious and we have no discrepancies in international policies, but I think that the fact that from the sort of impetus at the latter half of last year that governments were saying we want to, really get a better handle on it, and we want to do it in a way that, at the very least, it doesn't conflict with one another. It's so that companies that are looking to comply or are looking to innovate in this space aren't severely restricted in doing so.
Can you just articulate what are some of the differences when you're looking at security or security policy for AI versus other kinds of compute or software?
It's probably pretty emblematic of the broader policy style of both regions. I'd say that if you were to compare the EU AI Act and the AIEO, my alphabet soup of the day, the AIEO is more looking at understanding the scope of the problem and working together with industry to try to put some broad guardrails on it, whereas the EU AI Act focuses a lot more on market access and regulatory barriers. So less on the sort of more executive and strategic view and more on the sort of restrictive market access controls. The Cyber Resilience Act in the EU is a broad, sweeping piece of regulation that covers a very large segment of technologies, products with digital elements, as I mentioned before, and requires conformity assessment processes, where the US has adopted a labeling approach, which is voluntary at this point and focuses on a more narrow scoping of internet-based devices. So there's some harmony there, but obviously some differences in how the two regions regulate.
So on the ground floor, from a technology and use case perspective, at Opaque, we're already seeing this already. So we work with the International Counter-Ransomware Initiative, which is actually started from a cybersecurity agency out of Italy. The use case there is they're pooling sensitive data across 30 different EU countries in a Opaque workspace, running models against that data to find behavioral patterns on ransomware to prevent cybersecurity attacks. So it's something that we're already seeing come into practice, specifically in the EU, which obviously stricter regulations is driving that.
So you're also seeing AI be used for security, as well as flipping on its head, right? We're talking about security for AI, and you're saying actually we're using AI to detect potential threats.
100%.
When you look at the landscape of privacy-enhancing technologies,
are there specific challenges, that the government is looking to address with some of its objectives within the AIEO? And then, Jonathan, where do we feel like privacy-enhancing technologies are going in ways that can support policy objectives, whatever order you choose to go in?
I think it's really important to not only to understand, and Jason will be really interested to hear your thoughts on this, not only to understand where they are, it's also our job to forecast where we think the problem space not only exists, but where the solutions in the next 5 to 10 years might be there to address that. I think, trusted execution environments, trusted compute platforms is one of those examples, right? I think 10 years ago, if you had looked into this technology for a variety of reasons, it just wouldn't have been practical or really operationalizable for a business based off of the use cases that we're seeing. And in theory, it sounded great, but it just wasn't really a mature solution from a technological perspective. But now, 10 years later, you're seeing like Opaque and others who are really taking this and running with it based off of the advancements that have happened. And the government, I think, is a key player in making sure that we realize that opportunity of technology, whether it's through NSF funding, which the EO talks about in the privacy enhancing technologies area, or NIST, who's working on sort of standardization, best practices, understanding gaps and where industry is. You're looking at DARPA or some of the other national labs who have work that's focused on this space. It's an amazing role that the federal government can play, and it's one that we love to focus on. But the challenge there is understanding sort of that forecast of the problems that this is going to solve and the actual realities or what's within the realm of possible.
I think you nailed it. The innovation of processing confidential data with end-to-end encryption has actually been around for decades. Two techniques that stick out. One is secure multi-party computation. The other is homomorphic encryption, right? They've been around since the late 1970s. What's happened with those types of technologies, though, in terms of compute efficiency, it's been very low. In terms of ease of use, it's been very low. So not really widely adopted at all, right? You'd have to hire experts in cryptography. You'd have to maintain those experts. You'd have to pay them over time. Very difficult to do. And obviously now confidential computing is seeing a lot of momentum in the market. Confidential computing in general is actually very difficult to get going and to set up. There's some gory details around key management, cryptography, remote attestation that customers and companies just don't want to worry about. So for us at Opaque, we're putting the easy button on this. We're stripping out all those gory details and bringing to market more of a turnkey solution so folks can get access to insights on their confidential data in a couple of days, which we've seen as a complete game changer for the large and very large enterprise customers that we work with.
To piggyback off that a little bit, I think one of the reasons that things like privacy enhancing technologies are so relevant in this conversation around AI is, as I mentioned, this new primitive, which was an old primitive, which is data, right? And the impact that privacy and security of that data has on the ability of users to operationalize this technology, I think is new. And from a cybersecurity perspective, from a threat vector perspective, it also opens up a whole new realm of possibility that attackers can use to attack a system. That's something that's a good overlap when you talk of sort of the security benefits of privacy or the privacy benefits of security. But there are other really interesting technologies, whether you want to talk about, like it was mentioned, homomorphic encryption, whether you want to talk about zero knowledge proof type things. So NCD has been doing a lot of work on some sort of formal verification, these sort of mathematical approaches to ensuring security and privacy. The technology is making strides, and it has done so recently. And it's been great to have more of these conversations and apply them to sort of the current problems we're seeing.
I want to take a look at two different use cases that are a little bit opposite. One, Jason referenced multi-party collaboration, and then the other one is more like generative AI or maybe GPT models that are being trained on very specific, highly protected IP within a company. So one is like your own data and your own silo being trained to preserve that IP. And then the other one is, how do I preserve my IP when I'm trying to collaborate with co-opetition or even competitors to get more insights out of the data that we can all benefit from? I'm wondering if one of you can give an example of what do you mean when you say multi-party collaboration? What does that look like? And how do we protect that kind of thing using this technology that you're talking about?
Yeah, I can start with that. So we're seeing a lot of different use cases within the multi-party collaboration. So these use cases could be external to your organization. So you could share data across external partners, combine those data sets, run your AI, ML, just any basic analytics on those data sets. More often than not, though, we're actually seeing that with an organization internally. And I'll point to two specific use cases for that. One is in the financial services sector, where we have clients who have a lot of challenges and trouble sharing data between, let's say, a commercial lending team versus a payments team. And it goes back to the challenge around different silos have different policies, different procedures, different definitions. It takes months to get that data in a good place where they can actually share that data. So with confidential computing and specifically Opaque, The approach that we take is actually the opposite approach, where you'll encrypt that data at source or encrypt that data locally and then share that data. So instead of blacklisting that data, what you're doing is actually whitelisting that data. So the security posture that you're starting with is deny, and then you're actually choosing based on the folks who are in that workspace and sharing that data, what data you want to specifically share with that other party. The last use case I want to highlight is actually in high tech. We're seeing a lot of
HR use cases
in terms of payroll data, performance data, review data, a lot of exit survey data in the large enterprise. They're actually having problems sharing that data between their different silos. So picture data over here in Workday, data over someplace else in the organization in a Snowflake, right? No one is really allowed to access that data. So how do you share it in between those different sources? So again, a similar approach with confidential computing, right? You're starting at an encrypted kind of deny state, and then you're choosing which columns and which attributes to share to then run those models against that data. So specific permissions have to be presented and agreed upon to actually share that data.
I think from the federal perspective, one of the really exciting things is there are a lot of problems, particularly within cybersecurity. Jason mentioned sort of cyber threat intelligence sharing. There are a lot of problems around sharing data that have some similar contours, right? And once we can understand what does the technology allow us to do in a new way, in a secure, private way that we didn't have before, that unlocks a lot of opportunity for more visibility across an entire digital ecosystem, right? Whether it's through a software supply chain, or whether it's data that allows us to measure the outcomes of policies that we're looking to enact, is really exciting, I think, from looking at it from the policy side. And once we can decompose these problems into understanding what the commonalities are across them, I think we unlock a lot of value of the technology, and that builds momentum to allow it to continue to be commercialized, to continue to invest in it from the government side, because people start seeing that value.
Confidential computing, like when you're using the context of AI, as Jason was mentioning, you're talking about encrypting that sort of data in use. You can then activate hardware-based isolation and access control, which lets you do things around federated learning, attestation towards trustworthiness. And when you look at it from a policy context, you have organizations like HIPAA monitoring the data control of healthcare organizations. And patient healthcare data cannot leave those very specific environments. But with the appropriate confidential computing controls in place, you don't have to worry about that data leaving that specific environment. And so you're able to have sector-specific applications, whether it be healthcare, energy sector, finance sector. I think there's a bunch of different departments and agencies within the overall federal executive space that could benefit from applying these technologies in the context of AI.
Are you saying you don't have to worry about the data leaving its space because it's not leaving its space? You're doing something like federated AI, or are you saying you don't have to worry about it because it facilitates protection of the data in use, even if the data is no longer physically in that location? Are you saying we're creating a new kind of virtual location that we can protect?
From a federated AI perspective, you're creating a containerized environment to ensure that data remains within that container. For example, if you're worried that within your cloud operating environment, that you have specific data that you want to make sure that no one else has access to, you can spin up this containerized environment, encrypt it while it is in transit, at rest, and in use, so that you have more assurance than you ever really did before to know that confidentiality and the integrity of that data is maintained. And you can have a third-party attestation service to help further augment that.
Verifying that the hardware environment is what it says it is, and the software running within it is the software that you're expected to have it run. And you're not having injections of additional data or withdrawals of data that you want to remain secure.
You nailed it. That data is then isolated in a trust execution environment, like Taylor mentioned. And what that brings to the table is the concept of 100% verifiable trust, where every action now can be audited and verified, which is massive for these large organizations.
And maybe I'll ask Jonathan this, but to your mind, what are some of the key elements in establishing trust in sort of a compute infrastructure or data protection space?
One of the challenges that we face often is really around terminology, taxonomy, definitions, particularly in the technology space. And we're seeing this a lot in the AI conversation is when we start to talk about security and privacy and even trustworthiness, which has become a really important part of the discussion, we're borrowing terminology from what we know and what we've experienced in the cybersecurity context. And so one of the challenges which we continually have to deal with is as we're discussing a new technology, new applications of technology, or even frameworks or policy for setting up guardrails for a technology, we have to make sure that we really agree about what we're talking about. And I think trust is one of those pieces that is really hard to nail down, especially in an AI context. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, has done a lot of really great work on making sure that when we talk about best practices for, let's say, red teaming an AI model or doing security assessments, that we're talking about it in a really holistic way, right? If we talk about trust, it's not just can we verify that the integrity of that data, right, or that piece of software has been maintained, or the confidentiality of that has been maintained, but there's this sort of socio-technical aspect that we have to incorporate into these processes that is unique in an AI context in a way that we haven't really had to always account for it in a classic cybersecurity context.
How do you do that?
I think it's a long process, honestly. I don't think it happens overnight. And that's part of the challenge that Taylor raised, which is that policy tends to be a bit of a lagging indicator from where the technology is, because it takes a lot of alignment, a lot of understanding of sort of the different perspectives across the community and the ecosystem, because you can't have a policy for every single person or a policy for every single organization. So you have to really ensure that it's a consensus process, right? That it's not just the federal government who's talking about this, not just industry, not just the academic community or civil society, but that it's really this multi-stakeholder, international, even process to align on what we mean when we say trust in an AI context, or trust maybe in the privacy enhancing technology, trusted execution environment context, and really be clear about where, to the extent that there are lines to draw, where we draw those.
Yeah, I would be interested, Taylor, in your opinion also on this, because I think Jonathan, you're bringing up sort of an interesting, it's like you're adding another layer of social or subjectivity, which I think you always do, I suppose, in policy, and when you're sort of taking a stand as to what needs to be revealed or protected. But it seems AI may have yet another level of that to it.
You take into the social aspect of it, but then also, at least when you're looking at it from a federal level, you're looking, or even a critical infrastructure level, you're looking at what some people call mission critical functions, or what are you using them for? It's going to be so wildly different depending on your organization, the sector you're in, the sorts of customers you have, whether you're citizen facing. And the scale at which you can impact innovation and the speed at which you can impact innovation has just augmented to such a degree that it introduces a large amount of challenge, but also some really interesting use cases. Jason, you've mentioned a few, but there are some really great use cases out there for where you can apply some of these technologies in ways that may not have had as demonstrable of an impact before the advent of some of these technologies.
Yeah, and Jason, are you struggling with helping customers implement AI differently in different geographies? Because we have, as we keep referencing, I know there's some collaboration, but we have actual different acts and legislation and executive orders in different countries around the world that don't necessarily agree.
We're still learning things and we're still finding things, but absolutely, we're getting inquiries from India, from Europe, as things are changing over there. And they're in learning mode. They're not too familiar with confidential computing. So going back to that education process, it's a lot of educating and teaching them that we exist. So again, it's pretty early stages with that.
And maybe to build off of what Jason just brought up, I think it is important, especially for us on the policy side, to understand that, that this is going to be processed, not just because of the sort of rate of change of the technology. But as with any sort of complicated issue, this is a systems of systems challenge, right? As this technology starts to be implemented in the real world, they're going to be not just emergent properties of let's say the AI models themselves, but emergent issues that arise based off of these interactions between these really complex systems, right? And so it's important for us not to take our eye off the ball. The pace of work or attention or the conversation hasn't slowed down. In fact, it has probably only accelerated. And everybody is really focused on not just how do we set up these guidelines, but then how do we actually adopt this technology? People actually adopt the technology, that they're not scared of deploying it, because we understand that you're only going to be able to tease out some of these issues to identify, is this policy actually the right approach, if we engage with it and try and implement it for our purposes.
What keeps you up at night, Jason?
Good question. I think the generative AI and the sophistication of those models creating another attack vector in that threat, I think that's scary for everyone, to be quite honest. I think quickly, as people learn that those traditional tactics of masking and tokenization and anonymization, not only are they a pain, but they're pretty much obsolete, it is scary for everyone across industry.
Taylor, any final thoughts?
I want to keep all of this in mind when we start looking at future sort of priorities when it comes to security policy, right? I think this administration has done a very good job, as I said at the beginning of this discussion, of ensuring that industry is engaged when it comes to better understanding of overall AI security policy landscape, but also ensuring that those capabilities that can really drive change, we need to make sure that they are accessible at the end of the day. We need to make sure that agencies are able to use these to better improve the security of their operating environments. And so, we just want to make sure that we keep the foot on the gas as much as we can.
Thank you, Jason from Opaque, Jonathan from, oh my gosh, you're going to have to repeat the name of the extremely long acronym that you represent.
The Office of the National Cyber Director.
Okay. And Taylor, who is Director of Global Security Policy at Intel. Thank you all so much for your time. Very interesting conversation.
Never miss an episode of InTechnology by following us here on YouTube or wherever you get your audio podcasts.
The views and opinions expressed are those of the guests and author and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Intel Corporation.